welcome to a special edition of ASD, A New Perspective, the podcast show where we help you understand what is going on in the mind of your child, and we encourage you that growth for your child is possible. I'm Kat Lee, and in a special edition for Autism Awareness Month, Dr. Gutstein and I sat down and visited about autism awareness in the past, present, and in the future. So I was thinking with Autism Awareness Month, which really hasn't been with us that long, if you think about the state of all these months dedicated to certain causes, I was wondering how much more aware we are about autism this year than last year, and then over the last 5 years. And sometimes I feel very hopeful, and sometimes I feel very negative. I think it depends on who I'm talking to.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
Well, mixed. I mean, I think that there's a lot more awareness that there is such a thing called autism, but there is not a great deal of awareness about what autism really, what the consequences of autism really are, and what the research is demonstrating or telling us about what autism is really about. And there's such a gap between what we're doing and what the research is showing us, that it's just really concerning, and it doesn't seem like that it's changing. You know, there's still a myth that, you know, we know that early intervention works, and if we just get kids into more interventions and early interventions, everything will be better. But it's just not based on reality. And what the reality shows us is that the psychiatric illness rate for people with autism goes up to about 80% by the time you get to be an older adolescent, young adult, and a lot of it is just from the trauma of living with this. The suicide rate is at least 7 times higher than it is for typically developing people, for neurotypical people, which really is a makes you question, you know, the neurodiversity angle of it. The unemployment rate is huge, despite education and such. So, you know, the outcomes that we're seeing based on the interventions we're doing now, the most popular interventions, are not good. And yet there doesn't seem to be any awareness that we need to change what we're doing to reflect this. We're learning that the major impairments, the impairments that seem to be the things that keep people with autism from having a good life, from having success at work or in relationships, are not the things that we're intervening with, and are not in the ways, and they can't be addressed through the ways that we're doing intervention. You know, they're more complex, and they require a real developmental model, not a discrete skills model. They require the involvement of parents and families, not trained students. They require us to understand much more about typical development and how these abilities that are not being addressed in people with autism, how do these things develop in neurotypical children, and what happens there? So I think while there's more awareness on a general level that autism exists, there really hasn't been much progress in understanding what we really have to do if we're going to help people with ASD to be able to succeed in their lives, to be able to have a quality of life. So that's my greatest concern.
Yeah, I think you draw such a good point. It's as if we're not aware of the right things. You know, it's like, yes, there's awareness that it's happening, but we're not aware of what's most important.
I'll give you an example that, you know, we have now collected a large amount of research that shows that people with autism, the high functioning people with autism, are unable to save and represent and draw from their own personal experience. They're not able to develop a sense of self that has a continuity into the past, where they can look at their own prior experience and benefit from it, and retrieve it, and think about it and learn from their own lives, and develop wisdom about themselves, develop any kind of knowledge about themselves that they can use to help themselves to do better in the future, that they can learn from the successes as well as the things that don't work out. We know that even the highest functioning people with ASD really are unable to do this. And we also know that this ability to re-experience, this ability to access your own life experience and reflect on it and use it for the future, use it for planning and preparing and rehearsing and getting ready. It's based on hundreds and hundreds of hours of parents and children reminiscing together, parents carefully scaffolding and supporting their children step by step and learning how to do this and sharing these experiences. And we know that that's not happening in the families where the child has autism, because parents don't know how to involve their children in this process when they have ASD. And yet there's just nobody even thinking about that. To take away the ability to think that someone's going to have a successful life when they can't they can't own their own past experience, they can't have access to their own lives, is a fantasy. You have to be able to help people to do that, to have a sense of identity in the world, to have a sense of who you are, to have a sense of what you need, to advocate for yourself, to continue to learn, and to continue to, and just to have a future, to have the idea that you can look into the future when you're planning and preparing and mentally rehearse and try out different options in your mind about what might happen. Take that away from someone and you're taking away their potential for success. So that's just one of the areas that we know from research over and over and over again is not developing in children and adolescents and adults with ASD. And yet, there's nothing being done in terms of, I don't even think most people are even aware of that being such a large impairment. In terms of learning to use feelings, learning to use your emotions, learning to use what we call intuitive feelings to help you to be aware of what is going on within you, what's going on outside of you, to be able to manage those feelings effectively using, feelings are information. They tell us about where to look. They tell us where to attend. They tell us what's significant. And we know that with people with ASD, they have huge difficulties being aware of and being able to productively use their own feelings, their own embodied states, their own sensations, whether that's being fatigued, or distracted, or their emotions, whether that's being frustrated or surprised, whether they're feeling uncertain, whether they're feeling difficulty. They don't recognize feelings when they're happening. They don't know what to do with them. And so they're cut off from that experience, the way that we sample our experience at a moment-to-moment level, the way that we obtain information about where we should attend, about what's important to us, about when things are going right or things are going wrong. You cut somebody off from feelings, from knowing how to use feelings on a moment-to-moment level. And again, you're cutting them off from the potential to have a successful life. And we know that type of emotional awareness, once again, we know that begins very early in a guiding relationship with parents, where parents gradually help children to become aware of feelings, to be able to connect them to actual experiences in life, to be able to help them to distinguish, to differentiate them, to become sensitive to different degrees of them, to know how to manage them. These take years, and it comes from hundreds of hours of guiding by parents. And so what we know is that that's what happens. That's how it happens for typical development. You can't just give someone a course in emotions and expect anything to happen there. You can't expect these very important, these core basic abilities to develop unless we at least give people with ASD the same opportunities for development that we have for neurotypical people. So we know that there's ways to do this. We know that there are ways that typically developing children and their parents spend many, many, many hours over years gradually developing these things. We know that's not happening for people with ASD. And yet we don't seem to be aware of how devastating it is to not provide that for people with ASD, not provide their past, a sense of personal past or personal future to them, not provide a way to manage, be aware of your feelings on a moment-to-moment basis and use that information. Just those two things, you think about it, we take that away from anybody and you're really condemning them. No matter how smart they are or IQ, whatever, how do you function in the world without that? And yet, those are just two examples, there are others, of ways that we seem to be oblivious. And yet the research is there. The research over and over again is showing us that this is an impairment that is universal to even the highest, quote unquote, highest functioning people with ASD. And it seems to be, again, that there's a huge disconnect between that and what we're trying to do. And so that's, again, the area of concern that I have. And until we become aware of the research and what it's telling us and try to say, okay, well, maybe that's telling us we have to do things differently. Both the research on outcome, which is not pleasant. By the way, there's no data that says that all the early intervention we're doing has made things better. I haven't seen one study yet, and I've studied them all, that says that the money we've spent, the time, the effort has actually improved the lot of life for people with ASD. And so we have to look at that. And then again, the research that shows us here are the impairments that are interfering or obstructing the quality of life for people with ASD, and be able to say, well, let's try to design the interventions now to address those. So that when we think about what a good intervention is, it's an intervention that's gradually building those abilities, those motivations, that knowledge for people with ASD over a period of years, not weeks or months, but years, so that they can they can face the world with those mental abilities, those emotional abilities that we count on, that we take for granted in our daily lives.
The other area that I think is, it sounds really strange to say this, but I think that we don't have awareness. And you touched on it just a few minutes ago. I don't think that parents or the community around parents realizes or is aware of how damaged the parents' guiding relationship is. Of course, they wouldn't call it a guiding relationship, but as I meet parents and I speak at conferences, I become aware that the parents don't know what's happened to them as parents. There's a lack of focus on the family. There's a lack of focus on what happens to you as a parent when ASD comes into your life and your child. It is really devastating to think there's this whole community of parents who don't have an influence on their child's development.
I think that's right. And once again, we've collected a large body of research from studying infants and toddlers and their parents, those who wind up becoming, who are going to be diagnosed with ASD or have, and we look at them retrospectively. But we have a large body of research that shows how disruptive it is for a parent, how much your parenting intuition becomes sort of warped when you try to raise a child with ASD or with those vulnerabilities, and that it really disrupts the normal relationship regardless of the quality of parenting that you have. And I don't know if I don't think parents are oblivious to the fact that things are not normal between them and their child. I think that I just assume that can't be any better. That's the best it can be. And they sort of, do what they can. And that's very, very sad because, and that often gets supported by the clinical experts as well. And, of course, what we've learned is we can provide parents and their children with ASD with a guiding relationship. We can repair that. we have learned to do that. And that's really the tragedy, is that there really isn't an awareness that it can be repaired, that parents can become effective in providing those essential hours and hours and hours of influence, of guiding, of scaffolding, of developing those minds and the emotions, the emotional state, the cognitive, the metacognitive, all those abilities that require someone who is there day to day with that child, who is aware of what that next step is for them, aware of how to provide the support in a manner that makes sense to that particular child, who is concerned with slowly helping them to grow their minds. That only happens in a parenting type of relationship, whether it's parents, grandparents, or a regular basis of someone who has that primary responsibility for the growth of the mind. And when parents, I don't think parents realize, if you have an ASD child, that it's possible that you can have that. I think that the culture is such that they're implicitly develop the belief that it's not possible. And so all you can do is advocate for services or teach certain discrete skills, but that it's not possible to have the type of influence over your child that you would if your child was neurotypical. And we know that that's not true. In fact, you can have even greater influence, but it's not through just sort of intuitively doing it. It's through what we call mindful guiding. It's the methods we've developed to help people, to help parents to learn how to guide, to restore that guiding relationship that really has never developed. But there isn't an awareness of of what the potential for parents that could be. I think parents are just really underestimated dramatically. And then also the potential for their children is underestimated. And so we wind up giving them little social skills groups rather than providing them with the internal mental resources that develop over a period of years that allow you to make spontaneous inferences and adaptations on a moment-to-moment basis. So we give them courses instead. We give them these weak substitutes for what neurotypical children do, and don't just do from birth, do because they've had those opportunities through a guiding relationship. And again, the research is very clear in typical development about how these things develop. How do you develop empathic concern for someone? It doesn't just appear. It occurs through that guiding. How do you develop the ability to carry on a mental dialogue in your head? How do you develop the ability to reflect on an experience and make sense of it so you own it, so you can do something with it? How do you develop the ability to look into your future and look at potential futures and prepare yourself for things? How do you do all those things? Well, how do you learn to adapt? How do you learn to to be aware of your emotions, others' emotions, and use that information effectively? All of those are products of the guiding relationship. We have 40 years at least of research on parent guiding that tells us how that happens. But we also have research in the autism literature that says how early that gets cut off. It doesn't develop. We have many, many studies now that show that parents, lose that ability. Children lose the ability to participate in that. Parents lose the ability, because of the vulnerabilities of their children, to provide that. And it gets cut off, and then it doesn't get addressed. And the intervention literature doesn't address it. It doesn't say, look, we've got to repair that. We've got to provide these people with at least what we would provide a neurotypical child, and then more so. Right? Rather, they wind up getting less. Even though they think they're getting all these resources, they're not getting the most important resource, which is what the parents and the family members can provide for them. If they're trained and they understand properly, that's what they're not getting. So they get all these other ancillary things that aren't going to make as much of a difference. And they're deprived of the single most important thing for their development. And the consequences are what we see. And they're not good. So until we become aware of that, become aware of what the potential could be, what we need to be emphasizing, not more services, but but providing the essential service that every child needs every child needs a guiding relationship with parents, with parental figures. Until we recognize that, I'm concerned that we're just not going to make much progress. And proof is in the pudding. We haven't been making that.
Well, and for me, there's that proof and proof of parents, coming to me. And when I start talking to them, and these are parents, yes, some of young children, but parents of older children. And I start talking to them about what was lost and about them being able to have that influence. And no one has ever talked to them that way before, that they can be the influencer. And it doesn't have to be the way it is. And they will say, no one has ever told me that. No one has ever, I've been to workshops, I've been to conferences, but nobody has ever sat with me as an individual parent and shown me how I can be an influence in my child's life. For me, that's tragic.
Yeah. I think one real gap, when I talk to autism professionals, they have a huge gap in understanding typical development. I mean, they may have milestones, they may know this is supposed to happen at 3 or 4. Those are very superficial things. What they don't really have much of a background in, and I'm not saying all of them, but most, is understanding how children develop the most important mental, social, emotional abilities that set them on the course for life. How does that happen for them? And so the interventions don't reflect that, what we know is essential in terms of how to develop these things. And, I wish we could address that by educating people, but we find that many of the professionals, many of the experts don't want to know. They don't want to read it. They don't want to see it. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's arrogance or fear or whatever, but they seem to be closed off to learning about development. And when you read development, when you read developmental psychology, you see very clearly how essential parents are from the first days and onward into development in these essential abilities, these essential mental processes being developed. There's no other way to do it. It requires hundreds and thousands of hours of little step-by-step movement and development. Now, it's done intuitively by parents and parental figures, which is wonderful when it works that way. But when the intuitive relationship doesn't form, in this case, doesn't work, it's as if people are at a loss. And what we've done, I think, is say, no, we're going to do this in a mindful way. When it's not working intuitively, we have to do it in a more mindful, deliberate manner. And we have to be aware of why it didn't work and address those vulnerabilities and approach this in a slow, careful, very customized way for each family, but that it can be done. And so, I think until there's an awareness that people with ASD can benefit from what we have learned from typical development, they need to be provided with at least that. And so I'm saying is what I think is we should provide them with the base of what a neurotypical child would get, and then other services as well. Rather than what we do now is we give them those other services and we exclude the base. We exclude the critical piece of development for them. And I think that's really a tragedy. To me, that's when I look at what we've been able to do when we work with our families and what we see happening with those kids that don't have that benefit, it's very sad. It's a very sad thing to see. And I wish we had a greater awareness of what the potential could be.
Yeah. I think, though, I remember years ago you saying, and I've kept it in my mind daily ever since. I already knew it, but you said this: being humans, they are human beings who want what all people want. And I'm afraid that one of the reasons, and I say I'm afraid because I don't know, but I'm afraid that one of the reasons that folks don't focus on the development as if they were typical babies is when they get that label, they're thought of as the other. And that really concerns me, with our baby when he was 2 and he got the diagnosis, he's 24 now. We never thought of him as the other. He's us. He's being a little human. He's a human being. We thought of that then. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that in the professional world, it goes the other way. And that's why we don't see the approach that you take. It's not as if that base, as you say, is not thought about.
I think that's right. And I think that the stigma, of ASD as somehow so alien, it gets promoted a lot. It is really, it's very, very sad. And people with ASD are just people, or children with ASD are just children who have certain vulnerabilities that make it difficult to learn within a relationship. And, it would be like saying, well, people with dyslexia have trouble reading a book. So what we'll do is take books away from them. Think about that. That would be the analogy. So let's just forget about books and, they won't read. They'll do other things. Well, if you think about people with ASD, children with ASD are children who have trouble learning within this normal relationship. What we need to do, rather than taking away and saying, forget the relationship or change it so that it's just different, is to say, no, let's provide them and their parents and their teachers, if you will, the way to make that relationship work for them, knowing that it's harder for them, knowing they have vulnerabilities. Let's address that so they can have that relationship. So they can, the equivalent would be so they can read books. But, with dyslexia, we used to think the same way with dyslexia. They'll never read, so forget it. Put them in vocational school. Even when I started out as a psychologist, there was still people who thought that. And, give them books on tape and, whatever, they'll never read. And there's nothing wrong with books on tape, and I love audiobooks too. But we don't have that belief anymore. You say, well, if you have dyslexia, of course you're going to be able to read. We're going to help you. We're going to remediate that. Think about so many other things like that, where we don't give up on the core issue right away, and without even trying to address it. So here in autism, we're still in that very primitive way of saying, okay, what we see from the infant research is that the typical guiding relationship breaks down very early. It doesn't form. So rather than helping that vulnerable child and the parent who's the confused parent to be able to make it work, what do is we say, well, bring other people in there, do interventions, which are even more disruptive to the relationship. They're going to distort it even more. And basically we say, well, forget about it, and yet if you look at developmental psychology, we can't forget about it. It is the most important piece. And you ask any developmentalist, it is the single most important thing in every child's development. So so the tragedy is what we're doing with autism, is it because of whatever autism is, or is it because of the way we're responding to autism? You see? And what would happen if we start responding to autism in this new way, which is, okay, there's a child with some vulnerabilities, and by the way, each of them have different vulnerabilities, but whatever they are, they interfere with the formation of this critical relationship between parental figures and their children, which is the primary area for mental growth. And we need to address that as early as we can and provide those families with the training and the resources they need to understand how to make that work for that particular child, to make that relationship work, so they get at least the benefits of any other child in development, in all those years of development, right? If we could become aware of that, that would be to me, a revolution. Then we'd start to see some major changes in how we responded to people, how we intervene, and what would happen to them in their lives. I think we'd see some remarkable changes. And I'm hoping for the day when we have that awareness, that people with ASD need the same things as anyone else. Then children need the same environment for growth and development as anyone else needs. And we're going to work to provide that for them from early on, recognizing that it's harder for them to acquire it, to participate in it. We're going to work with it and then develop the methods like we've been doing in RDI to do that. And when that becomes the norm, then I think we'll really have autism awareness.
I agree. And I think about we can walk, we can march, we can even protest.
Right.
But we have to think about what we want people to be aware of. And we have to think of what future we want for our children. Some people, one of the questions, I'll be honest, I hated most in the journey is when a professional would say, well, what do you want for your son? What do you want? And I would say, I want what any parent wants for any child. Why are you acting like I'd want something differently?
Well, why don't you even ask that question?
What do you think I want? We want the same, we're not we as parents are also not from another planet. we're the same as any other parents. We want the best outcome our children can have in their lives.
That's right.
And that awareness has got to be key. I used to feel like, and I guess I still do, but not as much as I did. What is it about trying to be older and wiser or something like that? But I used to feel like we parents were also considered somewhat alien once we had a child diagnosed. I really don't think that anymore. I think more people just don't know what to say or how to act when they know you've had a child hurt. But in some ways, I still agree with my old self that when you're asked that question, you are being put in a different category.
Absolutely. Or where you're told that you should spend your time advocating for more special services as opposed to parenting, or where you should just raise the money for someone to come into your home to tutor your child rather than, even when you have the ability and you are home. I'm talking about parents who have the ability for at least one of the parents to be home and not told that they can make much of a difference. When you're treated that way, you're treated like you're something different. When some student could come into your home, some college student who's got a few weeks of training and assume that they can do a better job with your child than you can do, then you are being treated as different. And somehow something wrong with you. I've never understood that. That whole bizarre thought that some tutor or student can do more than a parent can do. It goes against everything we know in development, everything we know in 50 or 60, last 50 and 60 years of studying how children develop. And the wasted resources, the way that families and parents and grandparents and others get wasted in this process and are told things that do not empower them to be effective. It does treat them like they're different than a typical parent. No one would ever say those things to a developing parent. They assume that, hey, you're going to be the ones doing this. You're going to be the ones developing the emotional life of this child, the ability to, make good decisions and judgment, the ability to be to reflect, the ability to prepare and plan and set goals, the ability to motivate yourself. All those things we just assume parents are going to be doing, and to carry on an internal dialogue, to debate things in your mind in a productive way. None of those things happen in school. They don't get taught in school. We just assume parents are going to do that. And, nobody even questions that. And we know that it's going to take lots and lots of time and, and many contacts and many different activities with parents and children in the course of the day, whether those are work related or play, or, there are different ways we do that. But parent with autism, we just assume they're not going to have that influence in their child. So they should be doing other things, Yes, keep your child safe and get them to the right school, get them to the right therapies, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that they have this direct influence, that they can have that, it's diminished. It's not completely lost, but it gets really diminished. And so as a parent, I think you're treated implicitly in a diminished manner, as if you're somehow less able, or, are you going to have less ability to influence, to develop your child? It's very sad, and not true. And it's not true. But they're going to have more if they know how. They could have more. From what we've seen.
Well, the exciting thing is that we have RDI and we have a program that's been developed for both parents and their children and young adults, and for all. And that is an awareness we can really wrap our arms around.
And we hope something like RDI at some point becomes the norm for all these families, that they're all given the opportunity to be empowered, to have this potential, you know. And we're looking forward to that day when that happens.
Thanks, Dr. Gutstein.
Thanks for joining us for ASD, A New Perspective, the podcast show where we help you understand what is going on in the mind of your child. And we do encourage you that growth for your child is possible. I'm Kat Lee. See you next time.